Alrighty, Jeff. So we've got 5 topics that I think we both want to dig into. We both authored our own version of predictions sure to go wrong for 2025 around higher ed. I had my usual one of more college closures, but then a bunch of things around more work-based learning, experiential learning, and the like. And then you rolled out your crystal ball as well, and it also forecast more experiential learning and work-based learning or whatnot. But you also had this bigger one that I thought we'd dig into about why 2025 could be a year of reckoning for higher ed, and how, while that sounds bad on the surface, it actually might be a good thing. So I thought we'd start our show there because that is very intriguing. What do you mean by a year of reckoning for higher ed, and why could that be a good thing?
Yeah, so Michael, I think 2025 will be the year when higher ed really does start to face the consequences of its past missteps. And the biggest one, perhaps, is what it didn't do last decade to prepare for this decade, right? We knew a decade ago, for example, that the demographic cliff was coming. We started to see as far back as 2012 a fall off in undergraduate enrollment. We saw in 2016 the consequences of a national election on higher ed policy in DC, right, where we saw a drop off in foreign students that mostly drive graduate programs. And then in 2017, we saw the beginning of an erosion in the college going rate of high school graduates. You know, I could go on and on and on.
Yeah. I mean, this is frankly drove a lot of the college closure conversation on our end. It sounds pretty apocalyptic. So where's the good side of this?
Yeah, well, maybe, Michael. And it might sound like I'm quite worried, right, about the year ahead for higher ed. But actually, it's quite the opposite. I find myself feeling kind of remarkably hopeful because I think some institutions will feel that the financial, demographic, and political trends already taking shape well before this year started will kind of finally allow them to break free of those legacy models.
So what are some of those storylines or trends, Jeff, that you're keeping your eye on?
Okay, so there's a couple that I'm looking out for, Michael. First is what I call the trifecta in Washington, right? You know, I really don't think higher ed is ready for what's coming with the GOP fully in control of Washington, House, Senate, you know, in the White House. You know, we're thinking about higher taxes here on big endowments, right? Restrictions on foreign students, budget cuts, especially with Elon Musk in charge of that stuff, right? Across agencies that supply a pipeline of research dollars to universities.
Yeah, so if I'm sitting in a higher ed leadership seat, that doesn't sound that good, Jeff.
Well, it doesn't sound very good for elite higher ed, although I must say I'm not too worried with their tens of billions of dollars in the bank. Now, if this were 30 years ago, I think the lobbying associations that represent various sectors of higher ed in Washington would kind of band together and fight back. But not only are most of those associations now in a weakened state themselves, but in recent years, I think many of those major associations, whether they represent the private colleges, the research universities, the community colleges, they're really looking after the best interest of their own members, not higher ed as a whole. So what I'm really hopeful for here is maybe this portends kind of a new way of thinking about higher ed in Washington. You know, federal support, Michael, as we know, because we've both spent time here in the city and you've been on Capitol Hill testifying in the past, it kind of remains stuck in the late 60s view of higher ed, right? That original Great Society Higher Education Act signed by Lyndon Johnson. And that landmark legislation really has largely favored, you know, the old legacy residential colleges and universities that enroll traditional full-time students. And I think there's an appetite now on both sides of the political aisle for something different. Now, where that leaves us exactly with this next Congress and education department kind of remains unclear to me. But there are two things that I'm tracking. One is there's a lot of talk, as we know, about accreditation in DC and the role that the federal government does in the accreditation process. And I think there's a lot of focus right now on the outcomes of institutions, particularly in the job market. So I think there's going to be movement on that front, one. And second, we're not going to see an overhaul of the Higher Education Act, at least in the next couple of years, but I think we're going to see pieces of it. One that I hear being talked a lot about in town is around federal work study dollars that can actually flow to hands-on learning opportunities off campus, right? The kind of experiential learning that's largely reserved right now with students with financial means, right, who could go off and do internships and other types of experiential learning off campus.
Yeah, so your framing of this as sort of this anachronism, if you will, right, of 1960s stuck in that mindset and both sides being interested in moving beyond that, that's super interesting. I think the federal work study dollar point you just made, Jeff, is super interesting as well. I am surprised that you did talk about outcomes in terms of accreditation, but you didn't talk about accountability as one of those pieces of legislation maybe that starts to remake the HEA, even, not an overhaul, but as a particular piece of legislation. I guess maybe it feels a bit less certain than what you did list, but I'm not sure any of those are done deals either. Even as I agree with you that clearly the direction is spelled out, Jeff.
Yeah, I don't think anything is a done deal, right? We know that we're ahead. What's ahead in Washington is going to be very unknown. We're really going to be navigating through a lot of ambiguity over the next 4 years. Now, I'll tell you, there is one other thing that I talked about in my prediction newsletter for the coming year, and that is campuses that look tired and worn out, Michael. So this was kind of the second storyline that I'm really paying attention to this year. And I put a graphic in that newsletter that showed, get this, Michael, there were 90 million square feet of space built on campuses between 2004 and 2006. And if you own any sort of property, what happens after 20 years. Things start to fail. And colleges already face upwards of $950 billion in spending over the next decade for deferred maintenance, facility upgrades, construction projects. That's according to Moody's. And for years, colleges have tried to manage this kind of deferred maintenance bill by using extra cash at the end of the year, right? Their so-called margin that many colleges were running, right? So they had a little bit of extra cash at the end of the year, and they would drive that into deferred maintenance to kind of fix that proverbial like leaky roof. But what's happening now is that those margins are kind of non-existent, and at some colleges, they've turned into deficits. So as enrollments shrink, I think space utilization is going to become a much more popular term on campus. In many cases, I think it's going to be cheaper for colleges to tear down old buildings than struggle to maintain them. And if you live in urban areas, and we've had some presidents on, like Lynn Wooten in Boston, who talked about how they sold off, underutilized buildings. And I think we're going to see more of that in places where there is another utilization for them. And I think we're also likely to see a lot more public-private partnerships, which is already popular in student housing, where private companies are going to manage and take over some of this space. Now, of course, you have all that space. Colleges have all that space because the third storyline of the year ahead is the disappearing student, right? This is something we've talked a lot about on the show, so I'm not quite sure I have to take much of a deep dive there.